Welcome to the Runners Connect Run to the Top podcast, where it's all about learning from the best minds in the sport so you can train smarter, stay healthy, and run faster now. And now your host, Tina Muir.
Hello, Tina Muir here, and I would like to welcome you to another episode of Runners Connect Run to the Top podcast. I'm so happy you're tuning into another episode. I would like to thank you for taking the time to listen today. I know you have many choices to where you could spend your time, so I really appreciate you choosing to listen to Runners Connect. I also would like to thank you for the feedback you have given from previous episodes and your patience as I continue to grow into my role as a podcast host. I apologise for my nervousness. I'm hoping as I become more comfortable it will flow a little bit smoother, but I appreciate you being patient while I go through this. Today, let's get on with our show. Our guest is one of our writers. You may have seen him on our blog. He has written quite a few of our popular articles. Matt Phillips. He is a sports therapist with over 20 years of experience. He is a running performance coach who specialises in movement and pain management. He writes for Running Fitness magazine in addition to Runners Connect and is the head of the Hove 57 Run Club, which provides support to runners and looks at fundamental agility, balance and coordination training to help reduce your injury risk. Matt is also a presenter at conferences for Brighton Marathon and London Marathon. So if you had not already guessed, he is British. So I hope you do not mind the accents because you're going to be hearing quite a lot of them today. Matt is also known for his runner's MOT, or known as inspection, in the US, which is a 30-minute full-body gait analysis to look at what you can do to become more efficient based on your individual differences. So today's show, we're going to look at the importance of a full-body gait analysis, especially when compared to the prescription in most running stores based on just your arch alone. You're going to find out how to find reliable running form analysis locations from someone who really knows what they're talking about and what you can watch out for to make sure that you do go to the right place. We're also going to talk about how if Haile Gebrselassie walked into a running store, he would be prescribed motion control shoes, but in fact he wears neutral shoes, so things are not always as they seem. We're also going to tell you about how you can use comfort level to pick not only what footwear is right for you, but also testing around with orthotics. We look at whether orthotics are right, whether they're overprescribed, or what Matt thinks about this. Finally, we're going to talk about Matt's thoughts on a sub 2-hour marathon and what puts Kenyan and Ethiopian athletes ahead of the rest of the world, especially right now compared to about 20 years ago, what his thinking is on why we are struggling and why it may be just a little while longer before we reach that 2-hour marathon. So that's enough from me. Let's get on with the interview. Welcome, Matt, to the Run to the Top podcast.
Thanks so much, Tina. Thanks for inviting me along.
We're excited to have you. So could you explain your job a little bit, just what you do to help runners? I'm sure many of our listeners have read your articles on our blog, but just some information for those who may not have specifically looked into what you do.
Okay, so I'm a sports therapist over here in the UK, background in strength and conditioning. Not just looking after runners, but specialising in helping particularly distance runners overcome injury and pain, and give them advice on changes to their training and maybe their running form, aim at reducing the risk of re-injury and in process maybe improving their performance as well.
That's great.
As part of that, a big part of that, especially these days, is using full body video gait analysis. To look for maybe traits in their running form, even from a very early stage that could be causing overloaded tissues and restricting their performance.
Okay, so you're saying that you don't just work with, elite athletes, or in particular you don't, spend a lot of time with elites. This is for everyone who is interested in.
The majority of our runners, I'm from Brighton on the south coast, and it's a massive running town, and it's a great example of how the average age of runners has increased, and it's opened up to loads more people who originally wouldn't even dream of putting a pair of trainers on. So probably 85% of my runners are recreational. We do get a few elites in. There's a few kind of sub 3 marathon runners, but the majority are looking at kind of between 3:45 and maybe 5 or 4:45. So that kind of area.
Okay, that's good to know. So you wrote a post for us recently about how a running store gait analysis may not help you find the right shoe. For years we've been told you must get a gait analysis to know what shoe to wear, and you must go to the running stores. But how are these full gait analysis different to running stores?
Okay, so it was quite a popular post, a little bit kind of accepted a bit of controversy, but I've got to point out I'm not criticising running stores at all, or I'm not criticising any running store who kind of dares to put a treadmill in the store, but what I'm criticising is a model of shoe prescription that's traditionally been used in many running stores, and it's still used in quite a lot today, despite the fact that, despite good intention, there's absolutely no research to support this model, and there's even evidence that if used in prescription of trainers, it could actually harm the runners. So I'm referring to, like I did in the article, the arch type model, so the idea that we can categorise all runners into 3 groups based on their arch height, and then we can recommend them shoes accordingly. So most readers will probably have heard about the idea of if you're a high arch runner, you normally get the label over supinator, and therefore you're kind of recommended a more cushioned shoe. If you have a low arch, or what they regard as a low arch, you're told you overpronate, and therefore you're recommended a motion control shoe. And if you're one of the, in theory, lucky few who are somewhere in the middle, you're called neutral, and you're given a stability shoe. It's a nice tidy package, and in the past it has successfully been used to recommend shoes, and a lot of runners seem to have benefited from using this model. But when you look at the research, it's kind of 50-50. You know, you may as well flip a coin using this model. If it helps you, but it's not because of the shoe that was given to you. So the problem I see with gait analysis in not all running stores, but quite a lot of them, is they're still using this model. They're just looking at the foot down. So they're only really, in their experience, looking at what happens to the medial arch, and they're making a decision: are you high, normal, or low? This is the shoe you need. So that's what it's about, basically. It's not that there's a lot of running stores we work with who have got treadmills, and they're looking at the sort of thing that we do. So we're looking at the whole body. But there's still quite a lot of kind of brand corporate companies who have got the kind of foot analysis, and they're just still looking for how much do you pronate and calling an overpronate and things like this. We're trying to remove from the industry because it doesn't really help runners.
Yep, that makes perfect sense, and I'm glad you cleared that up for us, because I'm sure lots of people were wondering about that. So is there a better model we can use? I mean, you talked about the full body gait, but what does that involve?
Well, this is the bit of the problem, because it's easy. I mean, we can dismiss the overpronation model, but as yet science hasn't come up with an alternative model, and it may be a sign that we just can't categorise all runners into tidy little boxes. We're all very different, physiologically speaking, and our history of injuries and psychologically. The only model as such which research is supporting at the moment is quite basically the use of comfort as a tool. It kind of makes sense. If a shoe's comfortable, then it's going to help you. And although comfort's very subjective, research has shown that people who put on some shoes and it just doesn't quite feel comfortable, a lot of them, or statistically a significant amount of them, do end up injuring themselves. So although it sounds a little bit non-scientific to say, is this shoe comfortable, then that's the one for you, there's actually more valuable scientific research to show that's a good model for selecting shoes, rather than what does your arches look like when you run. Maybe something more scientific sounding will come from the future, and a lot of people are working on it, but at the moment there's not really an easy, quick fix alternative for selecting shoes for people.
Wow, that's really interesting about the comfort. I wouldn't have guessed that, but it makes a lot of sense. And thinking about it, you know, sometimes you do go for a run in a pair of shoes and it just doesn't feel right. And even if you may, you know, give them a chance, keep trying, but something, it doesn't feel quite right. And maybe there is more to that than we initially thought. So that's interesting. So would you say that overpronation has been misused?
Yeah, I mean, this is my colleagues and my peers have been trying for probably a lot longer than me to be showing that overpronation, the term overpronation, maybe shouldn't even exist. Probably some readers will have heard or read that pronation is a perfectly natural part of human movement, and we tend to cringe when someone comes in and goes, "Oh, I know what my problem is, I'm a pronator," and you want to say, well, fortunately you are, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to move much at all and you'd probably fall over. So this idea of overpronation suggests that we can say how much pronation, natural pronation, is necessary, and that's part of the problem, because we can't. A lot of kind of therapy and decisions are based on this idea of symmetry, that we should all kind of have level shoulders, level pelvis, and kind of neutral subtalar joint, but that doesn't really happen in nature. We're not symmetrical, and you only have to look at some of the elite runners to realise that symmetry isn't the way they win. There's some fantastic cases of that. You look at Haile Gebrselassie, for example, who's still one of the most famous distance runners, probably will always be. And one look at him on YouTube, there's some classic videos, and if he went into some of these running stores, they'd be offering him some serious motion control shoes of some form. And yet he does what he does, I think, in Adidas Zeros or something, a neutral non-stability shoe. So he should pretty much silence anybody who says you're an overpronator, because if anyone's saying that he needs help, then they need help themselves. There is such a thing as excessive pronation, but it's kind of more to do with moments, as in the amount of time you spend moving into pronation and then coming out of it. So one of the issues, again, with people even of my level of understanding and more, is how do you measure pronation, and also what are you actually measuring? Because typically overpronation in running stores, and also some other therapists using it as a form of treating runners, is how much the medial arch drops. So they're looking at something called navicular drop. That's very difficult to measure. We talk about neutral subtalar joint, but subtalar joints differs between different people physiologically. People have different shaped bones, so finding a neutral subtalar joint can prove very difficult, and research has shown that. And then also, although you think it's the arch dropping, if you think about it, if you imagine a foot, it could be that the heel is moving onto its inner edge, which will give you the impression of a navicular drop, but it's not. It could be that the forefoot is moving outwards or abducting, which will give you the same kind of impression, but it's a totally different source of issue. So, or it could be all three. So anything that's geared towards right, we need to control this navicular drop, because that's the problem, is kind of flawed from the start. So probably the best thing is, if at our level, and definitely runners, is kind of forget about this idea of overpronation. You can pronate too much, but the fact of that is far different than anything you're going to hear or be able to see yourself, or hear from somebody giving you a gait analysis in a shop.
That's interesting, and so there's so many elements that come into the term pronation, and so that clears up a little bit about why people would misunderstand it, and why it's so important to look for means just beyond how your foot rolls from the outside to the inside. So when you do talk about a full body gait analysis, what do you look for, or what does that involve for runners?
So the idea of full body gait analysis is, probably a more accurate term would be, we're doing a running technique analysis. And by that, we're considering what the whole body is doing, and not just looking at what's happening at foot level, especially if the model we're using at foot level is flawed and shown not to be very scientifically backed. What research has shown us is that what's going on in the upper body, especially the hips and the trunk, can play a vital role in controlling the movements of the lower body. So in other words, if you're suffering from some foot and ankle issue, or knee pain, or ITB syndrome, or you injured yourself, an ACL or something, then it's very important, and research suggests we need to look higher up the chain, what's happening in the pelvis and that. We need to kind of, by doing that and having runners come in and look at the whole body and start to appreciate that running is a global activity, we try and move them away from this idea that they need to rely on what they're putting on their foot, or how their foot is landing on the floor, in terms of improving their running or reducing injuries. No, it's about looking at technique, how they're moving, as well as their training program and other things which are more connected to injury risk, and conditioning as well, stuff they're doing outside of running, their ancillary exercise and stuff like that. So our whole point of full body video gait analysis is kind of to educate the runner to look at the whole body, not just think about what's happening at foot level.
That's interesting, and a lot of the articles we've covered recently have been about hips, and I actually had a full body gait analysis myself a few months ago, and the main focus of it was my hip drop. And I've kind of seen, before I thought, I do some planks and I do my sit-ups and things, and that's enough to keep a strong core. But with the exercises I've been given, none of them really are to do with my lower leg or my foot, but instead they're for strengthening the hip and strengthening the trunk, like the entire core. And that's interesting what you did say about the full body and looking at the body as a whole rather than just looking at one element of it. So if a running store has those force impact plates to see how your foot disperses the impact, would you say those are useful, or again, is it you need to have someone working there who understands the entire body?
I'm not sure. I know in the UK that it's not that typical to have force impact plates in running stores, and we work with podiatrists who use them in the prescription of orthoses and things like that. We don't use them in our Gait lab. I think for research, they've proved themselves vital. It's thanks to the use of force plates that we know, for example, that it's not a case of midfoot or forefoot equals less impact and heel striking equals more. Force plates have shown clearly that it's not a case of it's not a case of what part of the foot touches the ground first, it's where the foot lands in relation to the rest of the body, to the body centre of mass. So the force plates continue to help us along those lines of research. But again, as far as helping runners, especially recreational runners, I think in helping them overcome injury or improve their performance, and there's still a lot more we can gain by looking at the whole picture, by looking at the rest of the body, as opposed to just focusing on initial contact loads and things like that. It's difficult if you've got an elite athlete of a higher level. Even yourself, you're running 1:15 half marathon, 1:14 half marathon? Yeah. So that would be a dream for a lot of the runners I see. A lot of them are still trying to crack 2 or something. So they've got an awful lot of work we can do before worrying about how much force, or even trying to measure how much force is going through their lower limbs. Don't get me wrong, I'd love to have a lab like Dicharry's in Oregon or Irene Davis in Boston with a force treadmill and a massive, impressive and kind of runway with embedded force plate. That'd be amazing. I probably wouldn't see my wife at all, and I wouldn't, I wouldn't really get out of the house at all. But I think there's an awful lot we can do, again, to help the runner take the focus away from the foot and look at the rest of the body. That's how we work.
Okay,
anyway.
So could you explain a little bit about your runner's MOT? Just because you talked about, there's plenty of other elements that the recreational runners can focus on. But, that, like for me, that gait analysis was $350. It was a 3.5 hour thing. So can you explain a little bit about that? Because it's more of a realistic thing for the average runner to participate in.
Yeah, definitely. We started video gait analysis full body like about 10 years ago when there wasn't a lot of other people doing it. The shoe shops in our country, the big brands hadn't started kind of using it. And it was quite an elite, one because of the expense of setting up a lab and having the cameras and the cables and the software, and the treadmill alone. Having a decent treadmill that's going to replicate outdoor running is expensive. So it was something where we had to charge quite a lot, and the only people who really did it were people who were serious in their running and were willing to make that kind of investment. But as times have changed and people are now more aware of the importance of running technique with reducing injury risk and increasing performance, I felt that we needed to be able to give a product that would be more accessible to the everyday runner who maybe doesn't want to spend that much or risk that much. So we created this MOT, which instead of the kind of 2.5 hours is kind of a condensed 90 minutes. And it gives us a chance, as well as looking at the kind of movement patterns of the runner and doing some strength and conditioning tests, we also give them a chance to see themselves on the treadmill and point out some of the traits which we know, thanks to research, are common amongst runners suffering from certain issues, and also common amongst runners who maybe aren't able to reach their goals and kind of stuck and plateaued. And there's a few of those which, to tell you the truth, in 45 minutes or an hour you can look out for, and with the right eye and making sure that you're kind of not jumping too quickly and making too many conclusions. You can give runners of any level a lot of help. So that's what we try and provide with the MOT. And to tell you the truth, it's helping quite a lot. We're getting some great feedback from runners. It really helps seeing what you're doing in slow motion on camera, and it makes it much more easy to appreciate why you need to be doing certain conditioning exercises, why you need to be thinking of certain running cues while you're moving, rather than just being told to do it, from having lied on the couch. Because after all, lying someone on a couch and having lifting up their legs, there's a lot of loss in translation from that, and then trying to suggest how they should be running. You haven't even seen how they're running, so it's all come together very nicely, and I'm looking forward to how it pans out next year as more people come along and have it done.
That's interesting. It's kind of like what how you say a picture says 1,000 words. So if you see it yourself and see what you're doing wrong, it kind of ingrains it in your mind so that you can understand it.
Exactly.
And so people in the UK that are looking for your runner's MOT, I will put the link to that in the show notes, which can be found at runnersconnect.net/RC43. So everything we talk about in this podcast today will be on that page, so you can check it out. So Matt, could you explain to us about the 3 points of contact in Footstrike? You covered this in one of your posts recently, but just for those who may not have seen it.
So this is referring to heel strike, midfoot, forefoot.
Yeah, just for runners to look out.
Excuse me. Yes, this is another very hot topic, which we've all got such access to so much information these days, which can be great if you, for example, stumble upon Runners Connect. Fantastic, you can get some great quality info. But you go to some other websites, which you won't mention, and you're going to get confused, and also you're going to get kind of some myths that are repeated, and you're not going to know which way to turn. The Footstrike is another great area where we can help people by explaining what's going on. It's another example of how man loves to categorize people and put them into little boxes, the same as we did with high arch, middle arch, low arch. You need this. I don't want to sound too cynical and say it's an easier way to sell a product. It is, and a lot of people will cash in on that. If you put everybody into a category and say, you are this, you need this, what a great sales pitch. But it also just helps us understand, and it makes debate easier, and it makes, but the fact is, it's very rare that we can divide humans into such distinct categories, and the Footstrike is another example of this. Evidence kind of shows, and we've got to go by the evidence, that what part of the foot you land on does not influence running-related overuse injuries. And this might come as a shock to a lot of people, because a lot of people are very passionate about what they do and what works for them. So if you, for example, have got somebody who's a forefoot striker and they found that they're not suffering from any injuries and they're getting all their PBs, well, they're probably going to make a song and dance about it, and maybe even invent their own running style based on forefoot striking. And it might be very successful, but the fact is, not all people are injury-free from forefoot striking, just the same as not all people are injury-free from landing on the heel. So, as I kind of mentioned before, what part of your foot touches the ground is more of a product of your own physiology. It's the pace you're running at, and there's lots of factors, and it's not an indicator of injury as such, and despite what you may read. It reminds me, there was a study last April, I think, which used, as is common, soldiers who do a lot of running in their training. It was US soldiers, and they did a study of these soldiers over 12 months to look at how the non-forefoot strikers fared up in terms of reporting in for injuries compared to the non-heel strikers. And it turned out, I think it was something like 80% of the soldiers, which they looked at, male and female, were heel strikers. The rest were either midfoot or forefoot. And there was absolutely no difference in injuries reported at all. It wasn't a case that the heel strikers all suffered from knee pain. It was random enough to mean that there was no correlation at all worth mentioning statistically. And it was also interesting to point out, which is another kind of a myth buster for a lot of people, 80% of those soldiers were heel strikers. And that bears up with research from, I often quote when people come to see me, Pete Larson, a run blogger, his very interesting study done at the 2009 Manchester City Marathon. That's your Manchester, not our beautiful Manchester in the north of England. But him and his students, you've been there, I was being ironic. But him and his students set themselves up using a high-speed camera to film runners of the Manchester Marathon at the 10-kilometre point and the 32k point. And later on, they classified them according to their foot strike. And this is a real wake-up call for a lot of runners who come to me saying, I've just bought my whatever flat shoes and I'm trying to be a forefoot striker because that's the way I'm going to do this marathon. And I tell them, well, look, at this study at the marathon at the Manchester City Marathon, at 10k of this marathon, 88%, I think it was more, I think it was nearly 90% were heel striking. There was only actually 3% who were midfoot, and even less forefoot. Okay, and when they looked at the 32k mark, there was 93% were heel striking. So I look at the statistics, and they will say to me, "Oh, so I should be heel striking." But the trouble is, there's so many different types of heel strike, and again, putting people into three categories. How much pressure you put through your heel when you land, it could be what we call a proprioceptive or glancing heel strike. Especially if you're wearing a shoe with quite a drop on it and a stack on the heel, it's gonna look like you're gonna have a mild point of contact with that heel pretty much however you run. But there's a big difference between somebody who just glances that heel and then comes through mainly on the midfoot, as opposed to somebody who maybe is extending their leg out and landing quite solidly on the heel. But the take-home message is try not to focus again on what part of the foot is touching the ground first. Again, focus more on what's happening high up in the chain. In particular, how close your foot is landing to your center of mass and things like cadence and stuff like that. That's how you can change your running form and maybe reduce injury and maybe become more, increase your performance, not by purposefully trying to change what part of the foot lands first. There's no evidence to suggest that will help you.
Good. That was going to be, I was going to ask a question based on that about how people shouldn't, hear, oh, I should land on my midfoot and spend, time running, like purposely trying to change the way they're running without actually knowing what's going on behind it. Without actually getting that expert to tell you how. I know, I've been told for years that I'm a heel striker, and when I had this gait analysis, they told me about tucking my hips under, which made more sense and brought my foot closer to my center of mass. But for years, when people had told me to try and land on my midfoot, I could not understand what that meant. And I know a lot of runners will try and change their running form without actually understanding what's going on behind it. So that just emphasizes even more to get that checked out by a professional like you. So you mentioned about there's so much variety in how people run and their foot strike and all kinds of things. But you talked about in one of your articles about there's certain elements that are common to all efficient running styles. What elements are those? Do you see them a lot in elite runners, or what things usually are the best elements to have in a running style?
Okay, yeah, so these are the sort of things we look out in the gait analysis, and the number one thing I say before we start looking at somebody's video footage of them running is I reiterate, there's no one perfect way of running. Otherwise, all the elites would run exactly the same way, and we know from looking at a selection of elites this isn't the case at all. But not only that, your best way of running is going to be very much a case of how fast you're running, what your fitness levels are, your level of agility, coordination, all these other factors that make up fitness. So there's a bit of a danger these days, I think, of trying to make the person training for their sub-5 marathon try and run like Mo Farah or something. It's just not going to be the case. You can't expect them to have the same kind of heel pickup or knee coming up to that height, and you shouldn't expect them to have the same cadence as the elites. The elites are a direction which we head in, okay, because we know that they do what they do very, very well, but it's a direction and not something we need to pick up straight away. But so that said, there are certain traits which we can definitely work towards in terms of improving our performance. You just have to make sure it's gradual. And research shows there's some certain ways of moving and traits which coincide with certain injuries as well, which if we see during a gait analysis and that links with their case history and symptoms they're suffering from, then we can again kind of try changing things and tweaking things and seeing what happens. And that's a really important thing that we also put across in gait analysis. It is checking and seeing what happens, because there's no real guarantees. It's not an exact science all yet. All we try to do is look at the evidence and try things out and encourage to listen to their body and see how things are. It might work, it might not work. We definitely don't want to give something which is going to be dangerous, but at the same time we don't know yet. We can't give. It's not a recipe of you need to do this to combat this. So, but typical things we'll look out for. Briefly, we kind of over-mentioned already the idea of where the foot lands in relation to the centre of mass. This is commonly referred to as overstriding. And working with the recreational runners in particular, A lot of runners still believe that in order to make themselves go faster, they need to reach out further in front of them. And it kind of, if you're walking, if you say to someone who's walking, I do this with the recreational runners and kind of the Couch to 5K people who are just learning to run, we get them all walking. I say, right, now everybody speed up. And the first thing they'll do is they'll start launching their leg out in front of them, doing a fast walk, thinking I'm covering more ground quicker, my stride's longer. But in running, this is totally the opposite of what we need to do. Stride length comes from propelling ourselves on the ground and pushing backwards and extending the hip, not reaching forwards. So sometimes a runner's natural reaction is putting their foot too far out in front of them, the same as when you walk. And that's where the whole heel strike myth comes from, because if you do that, and you're landing on maybe an extended knee, a straight knee, chances are you are going to land on your heel. But the thing which research shows is a problem is the fact that your knee's locked out, not the fact you're landing on the heel. And it's that what we're trying to reduce through playing around with things like cadence and how many times your feet are touching the ground per minute. Not trying to say, right, put your toe down instead of your heel, or try and land on your midfoot. And we can see, looking high at the elites, and also just successful runners, that ideally when the foot lands, it's the lower leg, the tibia, is vertical and pointing down to the ground. That seems to be the most common trait. So we need to kind of work towards that, and we do that by playing around with another trait we look at called cadence, or stride frequency. Which for people who aren't familiar with that, it's just the number of times that your feet touch the ground per minute when you're running. So you could have two people running exactly the same speed, but one of them have got their legs moving around quite slowly. One of them have got their legs moving around like kind of a hamster in a wheel, but they're still moving the same speed. And again, we know that there's a spectrum where the elites, there was some very famous research done by Jack Daniels which showed that elites, I can't remember which Olympics it was, but all the distance elites were running at least 180 strides a minute. In other words, in a minute, him and his students counted, and their feet were touching 180 times in total, at least. Okay. Other research has shown that if you run at a slower cadence, so you're taking less strides and your feet are less than, I think it's 156 or 158 steps per minute, that has been correlated with issues with the knees and patellofemoral pain and that sort of stuff. So now we've got kind of an area to move away from, which is lower cadence, and an area to move towards, which is high cadence. The important thing again is not listening to the myths. I mean, certain running schools will say, I've misinterpreted, unfortunately, Jack Daniels' research, and they've showed, everybody has to run at 180 SPM. Everybody needs to run at 180, set your Garmin's, that's what you need to run at. And it just doesn't make sense, and it's kind of infuriates sometimes, not so much me, because I'm a very mellow, placid guy, but some of my colleagues just get very angry when you're making the suggestion that even the elites, when they're jogging along and warming up, are doing 180 SPM, because all you have to do is look at them, and a sprinter might get up to 220 SPM of a cadence. There's some I think, I can't remember the name of the guy, but there's some iron athletes who are running at a very low cadence. So again, it depends on the athlete in front of you, rather than saying everybody's got to run at this speed. But yeah, so cadence is something else we have a look at. Another one we will look at is all to do with pelvic drop and things. So a lot of it's a bit of a weird one, because there's a bit of a myth going around that if you sit down for too long, then your hip flexors will get tight and you'll stand up and suddenly you won't be able to move. And if that was the case for the human body, it would be a very strange looking bunch, because if we just had to stay in one position for 8 hours and that twisted us, it would be very strange. But there's definitely a case of when people do run, it's almost as if the brain realizes to get that leg behind you underneath, it has got this rather clever option of just dropping the hips down and achieving what we call hip extension that way. Unfortunately, although that helps get the leg behind you, it doesn't put the glutes in an anatomical position to actually get drive. So you're kind of getting the job done, but you're not actually propelling yourself back with the glutes and the hamstrings. So that's another thing we look at for runners as well, is whether they're compensating and achieving that kind of false hip extension. And the same thing goes with pelvic drops at the side. And there's a lot of research that shows that if your pelvis is dropping down at the side, then you may well end up adducting the leg in, or developing a cross gait, your feet are crossing over, and that's been linked with ITB syndrome and stuff as well like that. So that's kind of an example of different traits that we can look out for I mean, there's plenty more as well. And again, simple cues. What you said about runners being able to change their running drills without necessarily having to concentrate on something specific. Just things like, one of my favourite is running quietly. It's such a common one. We get them on the treadmill and they're running away, and I'm almost putting my fingers in my ears thinking, does this person not understand that they're wondering why they're getting pain in their calves or in their shins, and they're making so much noise that I'm worried about patients in the clinic next door. And then 9 times out of 10 I'll say to them, do you have any chance to run with headphones or anything? And they're like, yeah, how did you know that? How the hell can you tell that? And I'm like, well, you've obviously never listened to yourself running, have you? And it kind of makes sense when I say to them, take the headphones out, just try and run a bit quieter. Not because you're giving me a headache, but just because if you're running quieter, then that obviously is going to, in theory, reduce the impact you're landing. And it's a very easy cue, and people don't have to think about a particular part of the body. They'll just naturally do whatever it takes to dampen the noise. And the chances are that's going to kind of help them relieve chronic problems definitely quicker than think about what part of your foot's touching the ground. So yeah, keeping it simple, that's what we try and do.
That's interesting because you talk about how there's so many elements involved in running, and a lot of people will fall into that trap of, you hear, oh, you shouldn't have a cadence of over 180, and so people try and change their stride, but then you may go the other direction, or your hip drop, like you mentioned. I was told to tuck my hip under as if I had my tail between my legs, but for some people who already have a shortened stride, that may make it so that you're doing it too much. So I think what you said about running quietly, that's something realistic that people can take and work with, and obviously the preference here is to go to a professional and get your full body checked out. So we do have a worldwide audience, and how would you recommend that people all over the world what would you tell them to go look for somewhere that actually would help them rather than somewhere that just claims they help runners? Is this a case of you get what you pay for?
That's a great question. I don't think it's not a case that the more you pay, the better it's going to be. If you do go to an actual lab as opposed to somebody videoing on a track or outside, there's advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantages is going to cost a little bit more because the person who's got the lab has made obviously an outlay. The advantage of that is they'll be able to film you from the front and the back and the side at the same time, as opposed to having to move around you and put footage together. It's not going to be moving up and down. The quality is normally better. So you are going to pay more if you go to a lab, but it doesn't have to be. Like I say, you may well find, like us, we've realised that not everyone's got the same budget, so we try and tailor it so we can afford an affordable package. I think the main thing to look out for, rather than how much it costs, but main thing to look out for is just avoid, like the plague, any kind of form of quick fixes or magic bullets. And this is something I think that on Runners Connect we're saying time and time again. If there's a promise of a quick fix, or this is a magic formula that's going to make you beat your PB and blah blah blah, it's very unlikely. Running just doesn't happen like that. I imagine you know more than anybody. Also, there's no one optimal way to run. If there's any kind of talk of we will teach you how best to run, and they haven't even seen you yet, well, sorry, but that's impossible. You don't know who I am, you don't know what I'm trying to achieve, you don't know how my body is, you cannot tell me that you know without looking at me what my best way to run is. Okay, so that's another one. Being careful if at the end of it there's a product they're trying to sell you. It's amazingly easy to spin any form of assessment or gait analysis to making you therefore suddenly think, oh, you need to buy this product. You can tweak the results. Very easy to do that. So watch out if it's all directed at buying a product. And also, I think word of mouth these days, it's like always, don't necessarily believe the testimonials on the website. Sometimes they're great and they're real, and that's useful. But I think the most powerful thing is getting a recommendation from people people from your running community. Have a look at online blogs and things from real people. And just make sure that not only someone says, oh yeah, they're great, they're really good, but how did they help you? What did you achieve? Get something a little bit tangible. Well, I saw this person, and then within this time later I'd achieved this, or this stopped happening. So I think those traits are useful in finding not just a gait analysis, but anything for sports therapy, physiotherapy. Look at those kind of those areas, and it'll help you avoid kind of these charlatans who are going to take a lot of your money and give you very little in return. And they do exist, so watch out.
It's kind of like how, everyone's kind of trying to look for a quick fix, a weight loss pill, or this is going to make you be the best runner you could be. There is no, especially in running, it takes hours and hours of thinking about it. And as the guy at my Gait analysis said, practice makes permanent. And especially if you've been doing something for a very long time, it's going to take you a while to get used to. So it's good to hear that you said it's not so much what you need to look for, but what you need to watch out for. So just there's a few things there to be careful. I will go over those in the notes to go with this podcast, so you can refer back to those. But I think Matt brought up some great points there about just be careful of the person that you are going to make sure their primary goal is not just to sell you their product at the end of the day. So speaking of, overpaying for some things for your running, orthotics are quite often prescribed for runners. And would you say they are overprescribed?
Yeah, that's another area which is, it's such a dark area, and I think any honest podiatrist would say that it's a very unclear science as well. We've just got a podiatrist working in our clinic, and I'm over the moon because I'm just going to sit in on their patients and just try and soak it all in, because it's an area which is, like I say, the science is not very exact. The prescribing of some form of orthosis or kind of off-the-shelf kind of shop version based on the arch height, again, rather like the shoe system, is there's not any science really to back it. The mechanism is flawed. It works for some people, maybe 50%. It doesn't work for 50%, so you know that it's a case of correlation doesn't imply causation sort of thing. I think this is where they are at the moment with orthoses. Traditionally, science is trying to explain them by the effect they have on movement and trying to change joint alignment. And they're realizing now that because of the discrepancies in research, it's probably more a case of the effect that the orthoses has on forces. The technical term is kinetics as opposed to kinematics. So, and this kind of goes well with research on injury as well, because if we regard injury as a case of certain tissues not being able to handle the force that's put through them at a certain time in your training, then if the successful orthosis is based on changing the forces which go through your legs, things we can't see, then if we manage to sort out orthosis and the force change, then that could very much help us find a way of prescribing orthotic devices accurately to help with successful treatment of injury. That also explains why a lot of the time, one of the successes of using these flawed models is if you put like one of those little, a friend of mine, Ian Griffiths, is a great podiatrist. He kind of brought to my attention the fact that, those little kind of insoles you put just to make your shoes smell nicer. What they're called now. Yeah, but even if you put something like that in your shoe, it's going to change the forces. Anything you change your shoe is going to change the forces and how they affect you when you're running. And sometimes that might be for the better. So this is how sometimes you buy a new pair of shoes who are promised they're going to help you because they're stopping you from overpronating or something. But the fact that just changing your shoe is going to change the forces and it's going to make a difference. It might not last for long. That could explain why sometimes inaccurate kind of prescription of shoes does help, and why sometimes it makes it worse. My view on using orthoses is, if you really want to get prescribed an orthosis which is going to help you, then you need to go to a specialist. Especially if we're talking about orthoses depending on changing forces, which we can't even see. So definitely, if you're paying a lot of money, then you need to make sure it's coming from a specialist. So over here, with like podiatrists, I think in the States they're called, what are they called? There's a different name for them, not podiatrists over in the States. Can't remember what they're called, but anyway, different name.
I'm not sure.
I have to think about that. We'll have that in the notes at the end of the show.
Yeah.
But yeah, over here it's podiatrists. But then again, we use them as well. If you're open to experimenting and the orthotic device doesn't cost too much, you may strike lucky. It's a little bit like flicking a coin. I wouldn't base your decision only on what happens when you stand on your kind of wet foot test and your pressure plate, because we know that's kind of like history now. But I do it myself. I've got, for some reason, I found a orthotic device, a little insole, which if I do start getting symptoms of kind of chronic heel pain or something, then I slip this into my trainers and it goes. I don't know how it happens, but it works. And I found that, and so I keep them and I put them in when I need it, and I take them out when I don't need it, sort of thing. So you can play around on these cheaper versions of orthotic devices, and if you strike lucky, then great. But yeah, don't pay a lot of money, or don't let anybody say you need this because of this and it's a definite, because again, the science isn't there yet.
Okay, that's good to know. So again, what we were talking about earlier with the shoes, orthotics, if you can find them cheaper, is kind of with your comfort level. If it's comfortable to you, then keep it. So that's good to know. So if runners were going to change a few things about their training in this next segment, and they wanted 3 exercises that they could do to support their training, what 3 exercises would you give? I know it's difficult to pick just a few, but if you had to give 3 that would, benefit the body as a whole, what would you say?
Yeah, it is tricky, because obviously it depends very much on the runner, etc., etc., etc. But generalizing, what I often find myself prescribing runners, the warm-up, for example. A lot of runners don't warm up. A lot of runners have got friends who don't warm up at all, and they're never injured, and so it's tempted to think, well, therefore I don't need to warm up. But in my experience, the thing is about warm-ups, and I'm kind of using warm-up as an idea of what exercise I would prescribe. I don't look at warming up as just getting your joints lubricated and that sort of stuff, like the traditional ideas, getting your body temperature up. Warm-ups are about switching on the brain as well, and the involvement of the brain is very important these days with runners. At the end of the day, the brain controls everything in your nervous system in terms of fatigue, how your body's going to move, which muscles it kind of calls on to get which job done and what order. So I very much try to encourage runners to use the warm-up to switch the brains on, to warm up the brains. Part of that, and I'm quite famous in my neck of the woods for popularising the Lunge Matrix, which Jay Johnson in your neck of the woods is a big fan of. It was originally devised by Gary Gray from the Gray Institute, but Jay Johnson's done his version. I've taken Jay's and tweaked it a bit for mine. But it's based on lunges, multi-planar. So you've got a forward lunge with a twist, side lunge, back diagonal lunge, and a reverse lunge. And they're all based on waking up the body, waking up the brain to different types of rotation, which might be called upon during the running.
So this would be before you go running?
Oh yeah, for sure. Okay. Yeah, this is before. Because again, I try and get my runners to realise that a warm-up is not just to get them warm. Because if they think it's just to get them warm, then obviously they're just going to go for a jog. Mm-hmm. And for me, I say to them, okay, so go for a jog, your body gets warm, but are you switching your brain on? Are you kind of instigating different neural patterns and stuff? Are you improving your agility, your balance, your coordination, all these things which we take for granted, which we need, especially when in fatigue? They kind of say, well, no, I don't think I am. And I say, right, okay, let's go onto the Lunge Matrix and have a look at that. And the other thing I like about lunges is, one, they're low impact, so you're not going to suddenly launch. Even a jog, you're going to be obviously hopping from one leg to the other. So if you're suffering from calf problems or lower leg problems, then you're inviting that straight away with a high impact activity. So obviously lunges is one foot is always on the ground, but we're still practicing that balance element, which is another, to answer your questions, another exercise which I get runners to do, and runners probably don't do enough, is single leg balance work. The lunges is an example, because obviously you're stepping out and balancing on one leg, but also anything involving standing on one leg, such as rotations, maybe holding a medicine ball or something. We often give out single leg balance work for the glutes, particularly the glute med, the muscle on the side of the leg, which is very important with regards to pelvic drops, lateral pelvic drops. The glute med is traditionally thought of as a muscle which opens the legs up, which is why a lot of runners will do things like clams and lying leg abductions. The glute med does do that, but its main role during running is actually stabilising the pelvis so it doesn't drop down on the contralateral side. So I try and get runners to, if it looks like they do need some development of the glute med, which most runners and most people do, then I get them to do single leg balance work whilst rotating or twisting or lifting the hip and that sort of stuff. As opposed to clams and side leg raises, which may be useful lower down in rehab and stuff, but they don't really hit the spot as much for somebody if they've already got a particular level of strength. The other exercises I like to get runners doing, particularly in the summer when it's a bit warmer, is anything that involves a TheraBand, because again, it's a nice. Do you call them TheraBands? You know what a TheraBand is?
Yeah,
It's elastic kind of.
the smaller bands that you could put around your ankles or your knees.
Exactly, yeah. I think TheraBand is the brand. I can't remember, but
I think there's Power Band here or Power Systems.
Exactly, yeah. So anything that's cheap and you can put it. Obviously, I'm thinking about putting it around your knees or around your ankles. And there's so many exercises you can do, like lateral band walks or forward skate walks. All of the kind of, even if you're going down to the ground and doing some kind of donkey kicks or fire hydrants or all of those kind of exercises which you all love and adore, add a band to it and suddenly becomes more of a strength exercise. They're cheap, they're easy to carry around. I try and get runners, especially in summer, you know, who are my ideal and my dream is for there to be just as many runners kind of in the parks doing conditioning exercises as running along our seafront. You know, instead of just running forwards, they need to be doing crazy things with bands and jumping up and down off benches and stuff. Hasn't quite happened here yet. I know we're always about 10 years behind the States, because I remember going to Venice Beach like about probably 8 years ago, and there's people doing single leg balance stuff there and jumping up to benches. And over here, the British just don't do that. It just looks too absurd, you know. But it's needed, you know. If you're going to get some good exercises done, you need to get rid of that kind of fear of looking a bit weird. You need to do some strange band walks. So they're the three: dynamic warm-ups, lunge matrix, some single leg balance work, and do some stuff with bands.
I think you kind of cheated a little bit there. You mentioned quite a few exercises in there, but I'll let you get away with it. So just quickly, could you describe to us, if there is such a thing, what the biomechanics of this sub 2 hour marathoner would be? Do you think there is a particular, any elements that you would say they will definitely have? Because it's coming, but just a matter of when.
Wow, that's a tough one, and obviously it's very popular now with Kometto achieving his 2:57 or whatever it was in Berlin last year. I think it's important for people to realise, and I think people are, that it's still tracking the kind of time reduction over the years since 2000. It's still predicted something like, unless something incredible happens, it's still going to be about 15 years before it should be expected. I'm not quite sure. I know, for example, I mean, only the other day, I know it's probably, I hate to say this, but at the moment it's unlikely to be a British athlete. I hope it is. You never know, someone might come along, but I only say that because recently at a training conference we had for my local Brighton marathon, again, Brighton, UK, not Boston or Michigan. I think it's a Brighton everywhere in the States, but the main Brighton in the UK. We had the honour of having a presentation by a guy called Mike Grattan, who won the London Marathon in 1983. He's got a company called 209 because that's the time he got. And it's interesting because back in 83 there was, I think it was 22 UK runners who could run under 2:15 or 2:16, and Mike was surrounded and ran with people of that caliber, and he kind of put that down to why British athletes were so good at that time. There's a lot of them around training together. The sad fact is today, at the moment, I think the stat is 2013, there's not one single UK runner who can run under 2:16. You know? And that kind of makes me think, well, is it biomechanics, all this technology and training and changing we're doing, and how come is it 20 years ago 22 runners could run under 2:16 and today or last year not even one could? So it does make me think that in order to reach this 2 hour, it's not just the biomechanics thing. There may be factors to try and increase seconds, but there's something more important. I think when we look at the Kenyans, for example, or the Ethiopians and the East Africans, again, we try and look at what's different about them, what are they doing differently, and we come up with possibilities like they've got longer legs in relation to the body, their calves are thinner, so in effect this in theory uses less energy with each stride. And we look at things like VO2 max and low demand and stuff like that. But I think the Kenyans, for example, are a good example of they're training together. They've got to the stage where I think something like 60 of the fastest marathon runners in the world are Kenyans or something like that, and the rest are from Ethiopia or something crazy like that. So these guys are out together, training together. On a daily basis, they're seeing each other achieve great things. So it makes me wonder whether it's all, I mean, it is becoming more important now, but it's all this sports psychology and self-belief. There's one thing you going out on the track and thinking, I'm going to do this, and really trying to big yourself up. If you're surrounded by people who are doing it and you're training with these guys, I think that's the secret, personally, or one of the big secrets to why the East Africans are having so much success. And Mike was saying that as well. You know, these days I'm not quite sure how many British athletes are being surrounded by excellence when they're training. No, it's just not the case. Maybe the Americans have got more. I mean, you've got Ryan Hall and Dayton and that with their sub 2.5s or 2.7s and stuff. At least they're training with people who are achieving these things, and probably their morale is up. But when I look at the British athletes and startling stats like that, it really makes me think that if somebody does reach or break the 2, it's going to be because they're either training with other people who do that, or maybe it's because other interesting things. I think every time there's been kind of a surge in records, it's because someone new has hit the scene, some kind of superstar for whatever reason has come along and opened the doors and showed people that it can happen. I think if that does happen, someone does come along with some set of, I don't know, genetics or something and achieves a lower time still, maybe the country that individual is from will suddenly start producing incredible runners. He'll do a record or she'll do a record or whatever, and then suddenly everyone else will start thinking, oh my God, he's from my country, I can do that.
Kind of like the 4-minute mile, once that was
exactly.
broken. I could definitely see that being the case, and that's interesting to think about, and just shows the importance of running in a group, you know, no matter what level you're at, but running with people helps push you on. So that's good to know. Okay, that's all my questions, but I just want to ask one more quickly from Stacey Thomas, which is one of our Runners Connect athletes. And as always, if you do have a question you would like to submit for one of our future podcast guests, please let us know. We would love to hear from you. So you can check that out at runnersconnect.net/podcast. So do you think upper body exercises for strength endurance are important for running?
Again, I hate to say it, but it probably depends on what your current level of upper body strength endurance is at the moment. I think it can easily be overdone. I think even though we talk about the need for strength and conditioning, consistency and getting those miles in is something which is very important. I worry sometimes when I see training plans where people are doing maybe too much conditioning with boot camps and kind of that sort of stuff, maybe spending time doing upper body conditioning when they could be out there actually running. So I tend to dumb down the need to build up the upper body, and if you're going to do conditioning, then spend that valuable time on kind of hips, pelvis, that sort of area, and lower legs as well. If you're serious about running, then I would say limit what you're doing to what is definitely going to be involved in running. The arms are simply counterbalancing the legs. There's no actual drive that comes from the arms. If you're struggling, you can increase that drive back with your elbows, but it's probably more of a kind of psychological help and in fatigue. Ultimately, the arms are just balancing what the legs are doing so you don't fall over.
Okay, so it's good to know. It's probably wiser if you are short on time to put that focus into your lower leg and your hip area than spending the time with your upper body. So that's all the questions we have for today, but just something I am thinking about trying for future podcasts is I'd like to give me one word you would use to describe what you would like to achieve in 2015.
One word for 2015. For me personally.
Yep.
I have to admit that I am now an aging, I wouldn't even call myself an athlete anymore, but I definitely call myself aging. And working with I think there was a great article recently on Runners Connect, I can't remember who wrote it, whether it was John or I remember, on aging athletes and how training changes. Was it John? Yeah. And it's, for me, it'd probably be variety, because cross-training is always important for runners. But I think as you get older, you lose muscle mass and you lose coordination, agility, and all these things. So potentially cross-training. I work with a lot of triathletes. I'm not saying here on the record at all that I would even dream of doing a triathlete because my swimming is ridiculous. But I might try and get in the pool a little bit more and do some cycling just to cross-train and to support my running. So yeah, more variety for me.
That's great. That's a good word. Good start to the year with our first guest. So that's all we have, Matt. So I would like to thank you for coming on the show today. and I know I've learned a lot, and it's been very interesting and kind of reinforced some of the things I've learned recently, but I'm sure people have learned a lot, so thank you very much. And that's the end of our interview with Matt Phillips. I know I learned a lot, and I really found that really fascinating, so I'm interested to hear what you think. You can find all the links we talked about today at runnersconnect.net/RC43. If you liked the podcast, I would really appreciate it if you would give us a review. So that's pretty simple to do by going to runnersconnect.net/review. That will take you to the page, which will make it pretty easy for you to leave us a review. So if you have a few moments, we'd really appreciate it. Thank you. Tune in next time.
Welcome to the Runners Connect Run to the Top podcast, where it's all about learning from the best minds in the sport so you can train smarter, stay healthy, and run faster now.